was 17, sold like livestock to a man 4 times her age. Pushed into the village square in an ill-fitting wedding dress, Helga faced a future of servitude to the cold-eyed Viking count, who saw her as nothing more than a vessel for heirs. The crowd's mocking laughter cut deeper than any blade as her own father traded her away without a second thought. But fate has a way of offering hope in the darkest moments. In the crowd that day, a pair of summer blue eyes met hers, not with pity or cruel amusement, but with something that sparked a dangerous flame in her heart, a forbidden connection that could cost them both everything. What would you risk for true love in a world where women are treated as property? How far would you go to claim your freedom when discovery means certain death? The choice Helga faces will change everything forever, and someone is already watching their every move. A humilhação diante de todos. The bitter wind swept across the village square, carrying with it the scent of fear and resignation. Helga stood motionless at its center, her ill-fitting wedding dress hanging awkwardly from her slender frame. The fabric, once white but now yellowed with age, had belonged to a noblewoman twice her size, a cast-off deemed good enough for a peasant's daughter being sold to nobility. The hem dragged in the mud, a fitting metaphor for her dignity on this darkest of days. "Stand up straight," her father hissed through clenched teeth, his fingers digging painfully into her arm. "The Count is doing us a great honor." Honor. The word made bile rise in her throat. What honor was there in being traded like livestock? At 17, Helga had dreamed of love, of gentle hands and whispered promises. Instead, she found herself being presented to Count Ragnar, a Viking nobleman whose weathered face bore the scars of 60 harsh winters. The gathered villagers maintained an unnatural silence, a collective holding of breath. No cheers, no blessings, just the oppressive weight of hundreds of eyes, some pitying, others calculating, a few gleaming with poorly concealed amusement. Someone snickered from the back of the crowd. The sound cut through Helga's heart like a freshly sharpened blade. "My bride," Count Ragnar announced, his voice a graveled rasp that sent shivers down her spine. He stepped forward, his massive frame blocking out the weak autumn sun. The smell of iron and stale wine enveloped her as his gnarled fingers closed around her wrist. With a triumphant heave, he lifted her arm high, displaying her as one might show off a prized hunting falcon. Shame burned hot on Helga's cheeks. In that moment, she wished for the earth to split open and swallow her whole. How had it come to this? Only 3 days past, she had been gathering herbs in the meadow, singing softly to herself, planning a future with options. Then came the news: her father's debts, the Count's proposition, the hasty arrangement. Her mother had wept silently while sewing late into the night, altering the donated dress by candlelight, her tears falling unheeded onto the fabric. "She will serve you well, my lord," her father proclaimed, his voice unnaturally loud in the quiet square. "She is healthy and knows her place." Knows her place. As if she were a piece of furniture to be positioned correctly in a grand hall. Helga blinked rapidly, determined not to let tears fall. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. The servants whispered amongst themselves, heads bent close together behind raised hands. Their words carried to her on the wind. "Poor little mouse, and won't last a fortnight in his bed, and wonder how much coin her father got." The Count's breath was hot against her ear as he leaned down. "You'll bear me strong sons," he declared, not a request, but a command. His hand, rough from decades of wielding sword and axe, squeezed her arm possessively. "My last wife failed in this duty. You will not." A chill ran through Helga's body that had nothing to do with the autumn air. His last wife. The one found dead under mysterious circumstances. The whispers about her had traveled even to their humble village. And then, as if the gods themselves sought to torment her further, the rain began. A soft, persistent drizzle that quickly dampened her dress and hair. The muddy ground beneath her feet grew slick. The village elders muttered about bad omens, quickly silenced by sharp glances from her father. It was then, in the midst of this theater of cruelty, that Helga noticed him. Standing apart from the others, half hidden in the shadow of the blacksmith's awning, was a young man she had never seen before. Tall and broad-shouldered, With hair the color of wheat fields in summer, he wore the simple garments of an esquire. Unlike the others, he did not gawk or whisper. His eyes, blue as a clear winter sky, met hers directly, filled not with pity or mockery, but with something else entirely, understanding. Her heart faltered, skipped a beat. In that moment of connection, something passed between them, silent, powerful, dangerous. He did not smile, did not nod. He simply watched, his gaze steady and unwavering, as if he alone in the crowd saw her not as property being transferred, but as a woman with a soul. The Count tugged at her arm, pulling her toward the chapel where the priest waited to formalize this unholy union. As she turned away, Helga found her eyes seeking out the young esquire once more. He had stepped forward slightly, his expression intense, troubled. Their eyes locked for the briefest of moments, and Helga felt something stir within her chest, a tiny flame where before there had been only cold despair. The sensation was so unexpected, so unwelcome in its timing, that she nearly stumbled. What cruel joke was this, to feel such a spark now, when her fate was sealed? And yet, as the Count paraded her toward her doom, that tiny flame refused to be extinguished. "Move, girl," the Count commanded, pulling her roughly when she hesitated. "I have paid good silver for this day, and I will not have it delayed." Helga allowed herself to be led forward, her mind suddenly racing with possibilities she dared not examine too closely. While everyone else celebrated the Count's new acquisition, a dangerous question formed in her mind. What if there was a path no one expected her to take? The chapel doors creaked open, exhaling the scent of old incense and mildew. The priest, a thin man with hungry eyes, beckoned them forward. Behind her, Helga could feel the weight of the young esquire's gaze, steady and certain in a world that had suddenly become anything but. As she crossed the threshold into darkness, Helga made a silent vow. This would not be the end of her story. Somehow, someway, she would find a path through this darkness. And perhaps, though she scarcely allowed herself to think it, that path might someday cross with that of the young man, whose gaze had, for one brief moment, made her feel human again. The chapel door closed behind them with the finality of a tomb being sealed. O primero olhar proibido. The great hall of Count Ragnar's estate blazed with torchlight, the flames dancing across the ancient tapestries that adorned the stone walls. Helga sat rigidly beside her new husband, her fingers gripping the edge of the wooden table until her knuckles turned white. The wedding feast raged around her, a cacophony of drunken laughter, boisterous toasts, and the constant clatter of knives against pewter plates. She had barely touched the food before her, though the roasted pheasant and honeyed bread would have been unimaginable luxuries in her father's humble home. "Smile, wife," Count Ragnar commanded, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "My guests expect to see a grateful bride." Helga forced her lips to curve upward, though the expression never reached her eyes. A grateful bride, as if she should be thankful for this cage, gilded though it might be. She had been married for precisely 3 hours, and already felt as though she had aged 3 years. The Count raised his goblet, spilling crimson wine onto the tablecloth. "To my beautiful young bride," he bellowed, drawing the attention of every reveler in the hall. "May she prove more fruitful than her predecessor." Raucous laughter erupted around them. Helga's cheeks burned with humiliation as countless eyes turned toward her, assessing, judging. Some of the older noblemen exchanged knowing glances, their expressions suggesting they gave her marriage mere months before the Count would seek another young replacement. It was then, as she lifted her gaze from the untouched plate before her, that she saw him again. The young esquire from the village square stood near the hall's entrance, his presence easily overlooked amid the revelry. He wore a simple tunic of deep blue, the color accentuating his eyes even at this distance. Unlike the other servants who bustled about with pitchers of wine and platters of food, he stood still, his posture suggesting readiness to attend to his master's needs. Their eyes met across the crowded hall, and Helga felt a jolt of recognition pass through her body like a physical touch. His gaze held the same intensity as before, not the leering assessment she had endured from others all evening, but something deeper, more penetrating, as if he could see past the ill-fitting wedding gown, past the carefully arranged facade of submission, to the rage and fear that churned beneath. The moment stretched between them, seconds expanding into what felt like an eternity. And then, abruptly, panic seized her heart. What if the Count noticed? What if someone saw the way they looked at each other and reported it? She had been married less than a day. An inappropriate glance could be enough to brand her unfaithful, a label that could mean her death in this new world of nobility and strict codes of honor. Helga tore her eyes away, focusing instead on the goblet before her. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for it, the wine inside rippling with her movement. Had anyone noticed? She darted a glance toward her husband, but the Count was deep in conversation with a merchant from the Northern Territories, his attention blessedly diverted. The relief was short-lived. Every few moments she could feel the weight of the esquire's gaze upon her, drawing her attention like a lodestone pulls metal. Each time she resisted the urge to look up was a small battle won, yet each victory felt strangely like a loss. "Who is that young man?" she asked quietly, turning to an elderly serving woman who refilled her goblet. "The fair-haired esquire by the door." The woman followed her gaze and gave a small, knowing smile. "That's Eric, my lady. Serves Sir Leif, the Count's nephew. They arrived yesterday from the Western Holds." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "A fine swordsman, they say. Despite his youth, Sir Leif expects him to earn his spurs by winter's end." Eric. His name settled in her mind like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through her thoughts. A name she should not know, should not care to remember. A name she knew instantly she would never forget. The music grew louder as minstrels took up their instruments. The Count rose unsteadily to his feet, wine sloshing over the rim of his goblet. "Dance," he commanded, gesturing broadly to the cleared space in the center of the hall. "Let us celebrate properly." He pulled Helga roughly to her feet, his fingers digging painfully into her wrist. The sudden movement sent her stumbling against him, and she recoiled instinctively from the sour smell of wine and sweat that clung to his skin. If he noticed her disgust, he gave no sign of it, dragging her instead toward the center of the hall where other couples had begun to gather. The dance was a simple one, thankfully, with steps Helga had learned in village festivals. Yet every movement felt wrong, her body stiff and unresponsive under the Count's heavy hands. He spun her clumsily, his movements hampered by drink, and she found herself facing the entrance to the hall. Eric stood watching, his eyes never leaving her face. In that brief moment, as the music swelled around them, Helga felt something dangerous ignite within her chest. A warmth that had no place in the heart of a newly wed woman, especially one married to a man as powerful and merciless as Count Ragnar. The dance ended, and the Count released her with a grunt of satisfaction. "Sit," he commanded, already turning toward a serving girl with a pitcher of wine. "I will join you shortly." Helga returned to her place at the table, her heart racing not from the exertion of the dance but from the knowledge of Eric's presence, his gaze, the unspoken connection that seemed to stretch between them like a silken thread. "Dangerous," whispered a voice in her mind. "This feeling is dangerous." As the night wore on, the Count drank more heavily. His speech slurred, his movements grew erratic, and his attention wandered from his new bride to the abundant wine and the increasingly ribald jests of his companions. By the time the moon had climbed high in the sky, visible through the hall's high windows, he had nearly forgotten her presence entirely. That night, Helga lay alone in the massive bedchamber that was now hers. The Count had passed out in his chair before the feasting ended, too drunk to claim his conjugal rights. A temporary reprieve, she knew, not a permanent escape. Tomorrow night, or the next, she would not be so fortunate. She stared up at the canopy above the bed, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting long shadows across the unfamiliar room. In the flickering light, she allowed herself to remember Eric's face, the steadiness of his gaze, the quiet strength in his features. A single tear escaped, tracing a path down her temple to disappear into her hair. What madness was this to feel drawn to a man she had never spoken to, on the very day of her wedding to another? And yet, in the solitude of the darkened chamber, Helga could not banish his image from her mind. There had been something in his eyes, something that had awakened a yearning she had never known existed within her. Outside, the wind howled against the castle walls, mirroring the tumult of emotions that swirled within her breast. How long would she be able to hide this forbidden fire? And what would happen when, not if, but when, it could no longer be contained? As primeras palabras secretas. 3 days had passed since the wedding feast, 3 days of learning the labyrinthine corridors of Count Ragnar's stone fortress, 3 days of avoiding her husband's drunken advances whenever possible. Helga had discovered that mornings were her safest time. The Count rarely rose before midday, his nights spent drinking until unconsciousness claimed him. These precious hours of solitude became her sanctuary. On this particular morning, a pale sun struggled to pierce the autumn mist that clung to the castle grounds. Helga wrapped her new woolen cloak, a wedding gift from the Count's sister, tightly around her shoulders as she made her way across the inner courtyard toward the small stone chapel. She had no particular devotion to prayer, but the chapel offered solitude and a legitimate reason to be away from the main hall. The courtyard bustled with the usual morning activities, servants hauling water from the well, stable boys leading horses to be exercised, guards changing their watch positions with the clanking of metal and gruff exchanges. Helga kept her eyes downcast as she walked, having quickly learned that meeting the gaze of any man in the fortress inevitably led to whispers and speculation. As the Count's young bride, she was both curiosity and target. Her foot caught on an uneven stone, sending her slightly off balance. As she steadied herself, something red caught her eye, a perfect rose, its petals still bearing droplets of morning dew, lying directly in her path. Helga stared at it in confusion. Roses were rare at this time of year, and this one appeared freshly cut, deliberately placed. Before she could bend to retrieve it, a shadow fell across the flagstones beside her. Her heart leapt into her throat as she looked up to find Eric standing before her, his broad shoulders blocking the weak sunlight. Up close she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, signs of someone who smiled often, though his expression remained serious as he looked down at her. "You dropped this, my lady," he said softly, bending to pick up the rose. His voice was deeper than she had imagined, with the slight accent of the Western Territories. He offered the flower with a slight bow, his movements fluid and graceful for a man of his size. "It is yours," he added in a whisper, his eyes scanning the courtyard to ensure they weren't observed. Helga hesitated, acutely aware of how improper this moment was, how dangerous. She should refuse the flower, walk away, pretend this encounter had never happened. Instead, her fingers reached out, seemingly of their own accord, to accept his offering. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the ambient sounds of the courtyard. Their fingers brushed as the rose passed between them, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt of warmth up her arm. She pulled back quickly, clutching the stem too tightly, feeling a thorn press against her skin, a sharp reminder of reality. Eric's eyes held hers for one breathless moment. "The chapel garden has many such blooms, hidden from the frost," he said, loud enough now that anyone passing might hear. "They are quite resilient, despite their delicate appearance." The double meaning was clear, and Helga felt heat rise to her cheeks. Was he speaking of the roses or of her? Before she could respond, a sharp voice cut across the courtyard. "My lady, there you are." Helga turned to see Greta, one of the older serving women assigned to attend her, hurrying across the stones. The woman's sharp eyes flicked between Helga and Eric, her thin lips pressing into an even thinner line of disapproval. "I've been searching everywhere for you," Greta said, slightly breathless from her hurry. "It isn't proper for you to walk about unaccompanied." Eric stepped back, assuming the deferential posture of a servant in the presence of nobility. "The Countess dropped her flower," he explained smoothly. "I was merely returning it to her." Greta's eyes narrowed, clearly unconvinced. "How fortunate you were nearby, Esquire," she said, her tone suggesting she found it anything but fortunate. "The Countess has her ladies now to attend her needs. You may return to your duties." With a final bow to Helga, Eric retreated, his steps unhurried, his back straight. Helga watched him go, the rose clutched in her suddenly trembling hand. "You should be more careful, my lady," Greta said quietly as she escorted Helga toward the chapel. "People talk, and the walls have ears in this place." "He was merely being courteous," Helga replied, trying to keep her voice neutral despite the rapid beating of her heart. "Courtesy from young men to beautiful young wives often hides other intentions," the older woman warned. "And others will not see courtesy at all, but opportunity for gossip. The Count has powerful enemies who would delight in any scandal." Helga said nothing more but tucked the rose carefully into the folds of her cloak. As they entered the chapel's cool interior, the scent of incense and candle wax enveloping them, she couldn't help but wonder who else might have witnessed their brief exchange. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she found herself scanning the shadows of the chapel, half hoping to find Eric waiting there. The morning passed slowly. Helga knelt before the altar, her lips forming prayers her mind did not follow, while her thoughts circled endlessly around those few moments in the courtyard. The simple gift of a rose, the careful brush of fingers, the whispered words. Such small things to risk so much for. And yet, the rose hidden in her cloak seemed to burn against her side. A tangible reminder that someone in this cold fortress saw her as more than the Count's possession. Later, in the privacy of her chamber, she examined the rose more carefully. It was perfect, its deep crimson petals just beginning to open. How had he known she would pass through the courtyard? Had he been watching her, learning her habits as she learned the rhythm of the castle? The thought should have disturbed her, yet instead, it sent a strange thrill through her veins. A sound at the door made her hastily conceal the flower beneath her pillow. Greta entered with linens for the bed, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the room. "The Count asks that you join him for the evening meal," she announced, her tone making it clear this was not a request. "He has guests from the southern territories, merchants with connections to the royal court. He wishes to present his new bride." Present her, like a new hunting hound or prized falcon. Helga nodded silently, resigned to her role in this charade of a marriage. As Greta helped her change into a gown more suitable for dining with guests, Helga's thoughts strayed to the hidden rose and to its giver. What madness had possessed him to take such a risk? A serving woman had seen them, had clearly suspected something improper. How long before rumors began to circulate? The danger was real, not just to her reputation, but potentially to their lives. The Count was not known for his mercy toward those who displeased him. Yet beneath her fear, a dangerous spark of hope had kindled. For the first time since being forced into this marriage, she felt something beyond despair. That brief touch, the meeting of their eyes, the silent understanding that had passed between them, these memories shone like stars in the darkness of her new life. That night, as she sat beside the Count at dinner, nodding and smiling at appropriate moments while he boasted to his guests, Helga's fingers occasionally strayed to the small pocket hidden in the folds of her gown, where a single rose petal lay concealed. The touch of it against her fingertips reminded her that, for one moment at least, someone had seen her not as property, but as a woman worthy of beauty and secret gifts. A secret had been born in the courtyard that morning, a dangerous, fragile thing that could destroy them both. Yet like the rose itself, it held its own strange beauty, a promise of life and warmth in the midst of winter's approach. And no matter what came next, Helga knew with absolute certainty that neither of them could turn back from the path they had begun to walk together. O Sussurro da Aldea. A fortnight had passed since the exchange in the courtyard, and autumn's grip on the land had tightened. The trees surrounding Count Ragnar's estate stood nearly bare now, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers toward a steel-gray sky. Within the castle walls, life continued its relentless rhythm. Servants scurried about their duties, guards maintained their vigilant watch, and Helga learned to navigate her new existence with increasing caution. It was market day in the village that sprawled at the foot of the Count's fortress. Helga had requested permission to visit, ostensibly to purchase embroidery threads and fabrics befitting her new station. To her surprise, the Count had agreed readily, perhaps pleased by her apparent acceptance of her role as his countess. He had even assigned 4 servants to accompany her, an honor that doubled as surveillance. The village square bustled with activity. Farmers displayed their harvest bounty at rough wooden stalls, merchants hawked goods from distant lands, and the air hung heavy with the mingled scents of fresh bread, livestock, and humanity. Under different circumstances, Helga might have enjoyed the lively scene, so different from the oppressive silence of the castle. Today, however, she moved through the market with barely concealed tension, aware of the eyes that followed her every movement. "The Count's new bride?" whispered a plump woman selling apples as Helga passed her stall. "Barely old enough to be away from her mother's skirts. Young enough to give him sons, though," replied her companion with a knowing smirk. "That's all he wants from her." Helga pretended not to hear, examining a bolt of emerald silk with feigned interest while her cheeks burned. She had known there would be talk, of course. A young girl married to a man 4 times her age was bound to inspire gossip. Still, the reality of being discussed so openly, as if she were not standing mere feet away, cut deeper than she had anticipated. Greta, ever present at her side, shot a quelling glance at the market women. "Pay them no mind, my lady," she murmured. "Common folk have nothing better to occupy their thoughts than the affairs of their betters." Affairs. The word hung in the air between them, loaded with unspoken meaning. Had Greta chosen it deliberately? Helga's heart quickened. Did the serving woman suspect something beyond that single exchange with Eric in the courtyard? There had been nothing more between them, no words, no touches, not even prolonged glances across crowded rooms. Eric had maintained a respectful distance whenever their paths crossed, his eyes carefully averted, his manner impeccable. Yet Helga felt his awareness of her like a physical touch, just as she remained acutely conscious of his presence whenever he entered a room. She moved on to a stall selling fine threads, selecting several skeins with careful deliberation. Behind her, the whispers continued, flowing through the marketplace like water finding its level. "They say she has a strange light in her eyes these days," an elderly woman commented to her daughter, their voices carrying clearly to Helga's ears. "Not the look of a bride content with her husband's attentions." "The Count is hardly known for inspiring contentment in his wives," came the reply, followed by nervous laughter quickly stifled. "It's the way the esquire serves her," added a third voice, lower but still distinct. "Always so attentive, so careful. Have you seen how he watches when she passes? As if he's memorizing her every movement." Helga's fingers fumbled with the thread she was examining, nearly dropping it. They had been seen. Despite their caution, despite the careful distance they maintained, someone had noticed the current that ran between them. Panic fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird. "My lady?" prompted the merchant, his hand extended to receive payment. "Is something amiss with the thread?" "No," Helga managed, forcing her voice to remain steady. "It's perfect. I'll take them all." As they moved through the rest of the market, Helga felt as though the whispers followed them, circling like autumn leaves caught in an eddy. She kept her face carefully composed, her back straight, playing the role of dignified countess while her mind raced with fear. If village gossip reached the castle, how long before it reached the Count's ears? "We should return soon," Greta suggested as the afternoon waned. "The Count will expect you to be properly dressed for the evening meal." Helga nodded, relieved at the excuse to escape the market's oppressive atmosphere of speculation and judgment. As they made their way back toward the castle, she noticed a group of young women drawing water from the village well, their heads bent close together in animated conversation. They fell silent as Helga's party approached, their eyes following her with undisguised curiosity. One girl, bolder than the rest, stepped forward with a curtsy that managed to be both proper and impertinent simultaneously. "God's blessings on you, my lady," she said, her eyes bright with barely concealed excitement. "We were just talking about the preparations for the harvest festival. Will you be attending with the Count? Or perhaps—" She hesitated, a sly smile playing at her lips. "With one of his household knights?" The implication was clear, the provocation deliberate. Helga felt Greta stiffen beside her, the older woman's outrage palpable. "Mind your tongue, girl," Greta snapped. "You address the Countess, not one of your fellow milkmaids." Helga laid a restraining hand on Greta's arm. "The Count and I will indeed attend the festival," she replied calmly, meeting the girl's gaze without flinching. "As is proper for the lord and lady of these lands." She moved on before the girl could respond, but the encounter left her shaken. The rumors had clearly spread further and faster than she had feared. What began as subtle observation had already transformed into open speculation. How much worse would it become if given time to grow? By the time they reached the castle, twilight was gathering, the first stars appearing in the eastern sky. Helga retreated to her chambers to prepare for dinner, her mind heavy with the day's revelations. As Greta helped her change into an evening gown of deep blue velvet, another gift from the Count intended to display his wealth and her beauty to best advantage, Helga caught the older woman watching her with an expression that mingled concern with something harder to define. "People will always talk, my lady," Greta said finally, securing a silver pendant around Helga's throat. "It is the way of the world, especially in places where little of interest happens. But talk can be dangerous when it concerns those in power." Helga met the woman's gaze in the polished metal mirror. "What exactly are you suggesting, Greta?" The serving woman's hands stilled. "I suggest nothing, my lady. I merely observe that a young wife's reputation is a fragile thing, easily shattered by careless words or actions." She paused, then added softly, "Or careless glances." Before Helga could respond, a knock sounded at the chamber door. A young page entered, bowing low. "My lady, the Count requests your presence in the Great Hall immediately. Sir Leif has returned from his hunting expedition with news from the northern borders." Sir Leif, Eric's master. Helga's heart leapt, despite her efforts to remain composed. "Thank you. Tell my husband I will join him shortly." As the page departed, Helga rose from her seat, smoothing the rich fabric of her gown with hands that trembled slightly. The mention of Sir Leif meant Eric would be in attendance as well, standing behind his master's chair, ever vigilant, ever proper, and yet ever aware of her. "You have a strange brightness in your eyes, my lady," Greta observed quietly. The village women were not entirely wrong in that. Helga turned away, unable to meet the serving woman's knowing gaze. "I am merely eager to hear news from beyond these walls," she replied. "My life here is confined." "Better confined than destroyed," Greta murmured, but helped Helga complete her preparations without further comment. That night, as Helga sat beside the Count in the Great Hall, listening to Sir Leif's tales of border skirmishes and diplomatic tensions, she found a folded scrap of parchment beneath her trencher. Her pulse quickened as her fingers closed around it, concealing it within her palm. With practiced calm, she raised her wine goblet, using the movement to slip the parchment into her sleeve. Only hours later, alone in her chamber with a single candle burning, did she dare unfold the message. The handwriting was strong and sure, the words few but unmistakable in their intent. "Meet me in the old tower, tomorrow at vespers." Helga stared at the parchment, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The old tower, a crumbling structure at the western edge of the castle grounds, largely abandoned except for storage. A place where they might speak privately, away from watchful eyes and wagging tongues. A place where, for a few precious moments, they might be simply a man and a woman, rather than esquire and countess. The logical part of her mind screamed warnings. The village already buzzed with speculation. The castle servants watched her with increasingly suspicious eyes. To meet Eric alone would be more than foolish. It would be potentially fatal for them both. Yet as she held the parchment over the candle flame, watching it curl and blacken until no trace of the message remained, Helga knew with absolute certainty what her answer would be. If her heart would lead her to destruction, then so be it. Some fires, once ignited, cannot be extinguished by mere reason or fear. A Torre do Segredo. Twilight descended upon the castle grounds, painting the stone battlements in hues of amber and gold. The vesper bells had rung only moments before, their solemn tones calling the pious to prayer. Helga had slipped away from her chambers with practiced ease, having told Greta she wished to pray alone in the small family chapel, a request that, while unusual, could not be reasonably denied the Countess. Instead of turning toward the chapel, however, Helga pulled her hooded cloak tighter around her shoulders and made for the western edge of the castle grounds. Her heart hammered against her ribs with each step, her breath forming small clouds in the chill autumn air. The old tower loomed ahead, a jagged silhouette against the darkening sky. Once it had served as a watchtower, guarding against long-forgotten enemies. Now it stood abandoned, its lower chambers used only for storing broken furniture and discarded weapons. The path leading to the tower was overgrown, rarely used by anyone in the household. Helga picked her way carefully over exposed roots and fallen stones, painfully aware of how conspicuous her fine shoes and cloak would be should anyone chance upon her. The last rays of sunlight filtered through the nearly bare branches above, casting dappled shadows that seemed to move with ghostly purpose across her path. "What am I doing?" she whispered to herself, the words barely audible even in the silence of the deserted path. Each step felt like a crime, each quickened breath an admission of guilt. And yet she could not turn back, would not turn back, even as her mind catalogued the dangers that awaited if she were discovered. The tower door, weathered oak bound with rusted iron, stood slightly ajar, as though inviting her entrance. Helga hesitated at the threshold, suddenly overcome by the enormity of what she was about to do. One step inside, and she would cross a line that could never be uncrossed. "My lady." The voice came from within the shadowed interior, low and warm. Eric. She had not seen him properly since that day in the courtyard, had only glimpsed him from afar as he attended his master. Now he stepped forward into the fading light, and the sight of him stole what little breath remained in her lungs. He wore simple clothing, a woolen tunic, leather breeches, a cloak much plainer than her own, yet carried himself with the quiet dignity that had first caught her attention. His eyes, blue as summer skies, even in the dimness, fixed upon her face with an intensity that made her shiver. "You shouldn't be here," she said, even as she stepped inside, allowing him to close the door behind her. "Neither should you," he replied, his voice tinged with something between wonder and regret. "Yet here we are." The interior of the tower was surprisingly clean, as though he had prepared for her arrival. A small lantern cast a warm glow over the space, revealing a chamber largely empty, save for a wooden bench against one wall and a pile of what appeared to be clean straw, covered with a woolen blanket in one corner. The air smelled of dust and distant memories, with undertones of the pine resin that fueled the lantern. "I did not think you would come," Eric admitted, maintaining a respectful distance even as his eyes drank in the sight of her. "I did not think I would either," Helga responded, her voice unsteady. "This is madness." "Yes." He made no attempt to deny it, no effort to justify their meeting with pretty words or false promises. Complete madness. Something about his honesty steadied her. She lowered the hood of her cloak, allowing him to see her face fully. "We cannot do this again after today," she said, though the words tasted of ash on her tongue. "The village already whispers. It is only a matter of time before the Count hears." Eric nodded, his expression grave. "I know. I have heard the rumors myself." He hesitated, then added, "I would never bring danger to your door, my lady. If you wish me to leave the Count's service, to go somewhere far from here—" "No!" The word escaped her with more force than she intended. The thought of him leaving, of never seeing him again, produced a pain so sharp it took her breath away. "No," she repeated more softly. "That is not what I want." He took a step toward her, then another, moving with the cautious grace of a man approaching a wild creature he fears might bolt. "What do you want, Helga?" Her name on his lips, not "my lady" or "countess," but her name, spoken with such tenderness, broke something inside her. The careful walls she had constructed around her heart since the day of her marriage crumbled like sand castles before the tide. "I don't know," she whispered, and it was the most honest thing she had said in weeks. "I only know that when I saw you in the village square that day, something changed, as though I had been walking through a fog and suddenly could see clearly." Another step brought him close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could see the pulse beating at the base of his throat. "From the moment I saw you," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "standing there in that ill-fitting wedding dress, your eyes so full of dignity despite your circumstance, I knew my life had changed forever." "This isn't right," Helga protested weakly, even as she swayed toward him, drawn by a force stronger than conscience or fear. "No," he agreed, "it isn't." And yet, his hand rose slowly, giving her every chance to retreat, to maintain the proper distance between them. When she remained still, he gently, so gently, brushed his fingertips against her cheek. The touch, innocent by any measure, sent fire racing through her veins. "Eric," she breathed, her eyes closing as she leaned into his touch. It was their first true contact, not the accidental brush of fingers as he handed her the rose, but a deliberate touch, a conscious choice made by both. His palm cupped her cheek, warm and calloused from sword practice, yet infinitely tender in its care. "I have thought of nothing else but you," he confessed. "Every waking moment, every dream. It is as though a spell has been cast upon me." Helga opened her eyes to find his face mere inches from her own, his gaze searching, questioning. She had never been kissed, not properly. The Count's drunken pawings could hardly be called kisses, more like assaults to be endured rather than pleasures to be shared. "I have never," she began, but couldn't find the words to continue. Understanding dawned in Eric's eyes. "I would never presume," he said, beginning to withdraw his hand. Helga caught it with her own, pressing his palm back against her cheek. "I did not say I didn't want you to," she whispered. The moment stretched between them, fraught with possibility and danger in equal measure. Then, with infinite slowness, Eric leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was everything Helga had secretly imagined and nothing like she had expected. Soft at first, reverent, as though he feared she might shatter beneath his touch. Then deeper, more insistent, as she responded with a hunger that surprised them both. His arms encircled her, drawing her against the solid warmth of his chest. And for the first time since her marriage, Helga felt not like property to be used, but like a woman treasured and desired. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, Eric rested his forehead against hers. "I would die for this moment," he said simply, the words carrying the weight of absolute truth. "As would I," she replied, and knew it for the most solemn vow she had ever made, far more binding than the empty promises forced from her lips at her wedding. In that perfect stolen moment, the future with all its perils seemed distant and unimportant. There was only the lantern's glow, the whisper of their breathing, and the miraculous discovery of what it meant to be truly seen by another soul. Then came the sound that shattered their sanctuary, a footstep on the stairs leading to the tower, followed by the unmistakable creak of weight on ancient wood. They froze, still entwined in each other's arms, as the sound came again. Someone was climbing toward them, moving slowly, deliberately, as though in no hurry to reach the top. The steps paused, then continued, each one bringing discovery closer. "Hide," Eric whispered urgently, already moving to position himself between Helga and the door. "Behind those crates, quickly." But Helga knew it was too late for concealment. The tower room offered few hiding places, and whoever approached would surely search thoroughly once they arrived. Instead, she straightened her cloak and wiped her lips, as though she could erase the evidence of their transgression. "We face this together," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The footsteps reached the landing outside the door. A shadow passed across the small gap where the hinges allowed a sliver of visibility. The lantern flame flickered in a sudden draft, casting monstrous shapes across the walls. Helga felt Eric's hand find hers, squeezing once. Reassurance, apology, and farewell, all compressed into that single gesture. The door began to open. O peso de descoberta. Morning light filtered through the high windows of the great hall, casting long rectangles of pale gold across the rush-strewn floor. Helga sat at the high table, breaking her fast with small, careful movements that belied the chaos of her thoughts. She had barely slept, the events of the previous evening replaying endlessly behind her closed eyelids. The memory of Eric's kiss still burned on her lips, a phantom sensation both exquisite and terrifying. More terrifying still was the recollection of what had followed, the slow opening of the tower door, the moment of breathless anticipation, and then the appearance of Olga, one of the kitchen maids, carrying a basket of dried herbs she had apparently been sent to retrieve from storage. The girl had been as startled to find the Countess and an esquire in the abandoned tower as they had been to see her. Her round face had registered shock, confusion, and then, most dangerously of all, understanding. No words had been exchanged, none were necessary. The tableau spoke for itself. The Countess and a servant, alone in a forgotten corner of the castle, standing closer than propriety would ever allow. Olga had backed away with a hasty curtsy and fled down the stairs without completing her errand. Helga and Eric had parted immediately afterward, both understanding that their secret was no longer theirs alone. Now, as Helga methodically tore a piece of bread into smaller and smaller fragments, she felt the weight of unseen eyes upon her. The serving women moved about the hall with unusual quietness, their gazes averted whenever she looked their way. The silence held a tension that seemed to vibrate in the air, like the aftermath of a thunderclap. The Count entered the hall with his usual heavy tread, his fur-trimmed cloak sweeping behind him as he made his way to the high table. Helga steeled herself, raising her eyes to greet him with the dutiful smile expected of a wife. What she saw made her blood run cold. His expression was not the usual morning scowl of a man nursing the remnants of the previous night's excesses. Instead, his face bore a calculating stillness, his eyes hard as he regarded her across the table. He said nothing as he took his seat, accepting a goblet of watered wine from a servant with a curt nod. "You are quiet this morning, husband?" Helga ventured, her voice remarkably steady, despite the fear coiling in her stomach. Count Ragnar took a long drink before answering. "Am I?" he said finally. "Perhaps I am simply contemplative." The way he emphasized the last word sent a chill down Helga's spine. She forced herself to maintain eye contact, to keep her hands from trembling as she reached for her own goblet. "And what occupies your thoughts so deeply?" she asked, the picture of wifely concern. The Count's lips curled in what might have been a smile on another man's face. On his, it resembled nothing so much as a wolf baring its teeth. "Loyalty," he said. "And its opposite." Helga's heart stuttered in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. "Weighty matters indeed for the breakfast table," she observed, attempting to steer the conversation toward safer ground. "Weighty matters for any time of day," he countered, leaning forward slightly. "Tell me, wife, do you consider yourself loyal to your husband?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. Helga felt heat rise to her cheeks, even as a cold sweat broke out across her back. "Of course," she replied, the lie bitter on her tongue. "I have taken sacred vows." The Count studied her face for what felt like an eternity, his eyes boring into hers as though he could extract the truth through sheer force of will. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Vows," he repeated. "Yes, sacred vows before God and witnesses, not to be taken lightly, as my second wife discovered to her great sorrow." The threat hung in the air between them, all the more menacing for being obliquely stated. Helga had heard the whispered stories about the Count's second wife, how she had been found dead in circumstances that were never fully explained, how rumors of her infidelity had circulated briefly before being ruthlessly suppressed. "I remember my vows well," she said quietly. The Count grunted, turning his attention to the plate of cold meats a servant placed before him. "See that you do," he said. "I am not a man who tolerates betrayal." The meal continued in uncomfortable silence, the Count periodically glancing at her with that same unsettling intensity. When he had finished eating, he rose abruptly. "I ride to inspect the western fields today," he announced. "Do not wait dinner for me. I may be late returning." Helga nodded, relief washing through her at the prospect of his absence, however temporary. As he turned to leave, he paused, looking back at her with narrowed eyes. "Stay within the castle today," he ordered. "The weather promises to turn foul." It was not a request. The sky outside the windows was clear, the autumn day bright and crisp. His meaning was clear enough. He wanted her where she could be watched. "As you wish, husband," Helga replied, lowering her eyes in feigned submission. Throughout the day, Helga moved through the castle with deliberate calm, attending to the small duties expected of the lady of the house. She supervised the changing of linens in the guest chambers, conferred with the cook about provisions for the coming week, and spent 2 hours working on an embroidered altar cloth for the chapel. All perfectly appropriate activities for a noblewoman, all conducted under the watchful eyes of servants who seemed unusually attentive to her movements. It was Greta who finally confirmed her suspicions, approaching her as she sat by the fire in the lady's solar, industriously working her needle through the fine linen. "My lady," the older woman said quietly, making a show of adjusting the cushions on a nearby chair. "You should know that Olga has been speaking with the Count's steward." Helga's needle paused mid-stitch, though she kept her face carefully expressionless. "Has she? About what matter?" Greta glanced toward the door to ensure they were not overheard. "About finding you in the old tower yesterday evening, with the esquire." There it was, the confirmation she had been dreading. Helga set her embroidery aside, her hands suddenly unsteady. "I see," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The steward went directly to the Count this morning before dawn," Greta continued, her tone matter-of-fact but her eyes full of warning. "I thought you should be prepared." Prepared. What preparation could there be for the wrath of a powerful man who believed himself betrayed? Helga closed her eyes briefly, memories of Eric's gentle touch contrasting cruelly with the reality of her situation. "Thank you for telling me," she said at last, meeting the serving woman's gaze with dignity. "You have been kind, Greta." The older woman sniffed, but her expression softened fractionally. "I've served 3 countesses in this castle," she said. "I've seen how a young heart yearns for tenderness. But yearning doesn't change reality, my lady. The Count is not known for his mercy." With that sobering reminder, Greta curtsied and withdrew, leaving Helga alone with her troubled thoughts. Outside, contrary to the Count's false prediction, the day remained fair, though the sharp wind carried the promise of winter's approach. Inside, Helga felt a storm gathering around her, invisible but no less deadly for its silence. As dusk fell, bringing with it the routine activities of the evening, Helga found herself watching the servants with new awareness. Which ones reported to the Count's steward? Which might be sympathetic to her? Most importantly, had anyone seen her with Eric beyond that single encounter in the tower? The memory of their kiss seemed to burn even brighter amidst the danger, a moment of genuine feeling in a life otherwise defined by obligation and pretense. Whatever the consequences, Helga could not bring herself to regret it. Her reverie was interrupted by the arrival of a servant she recognized as one of Olga's friends from the kitchen, a thin girl with nervous eyes who bobbed an awkward curtsy before thrusting a small package wrapped in cloth into Helga's hands. "From Agatha the Herbwoman, my lady," the girl mumbled, already backing away. "For your monthly courses," she said. Helga frowned in confusion. She had sent no request to the village herbwoman, and her monthly bleeding was not due for at least a fortnight. As the servant scurried away, she carefully unwrapped the small bundle, revealing a handful of dried leaves and a carved wooden cross, small enough to fit in the palm of her hand. Her breath caught in her throat. The cross, simple but beautifully made, polished to a warm glow, could only have come from Eric. Somehow, despite the danger, despite the watchful eyes that now followed her every move, he had found a way to send her this token. Helga quickly rewrapped the package, tucking it into the pouch that hung at her waist. The meaning of his gift was clear, even without words to accompany it. "Even if the world condemns us, I am with you." A promise, a pledge of fidelity that transcended their impossible circumstances. That night, as she prepared for bed alone, the Count had indeed not returned from his day's excursion. Helga held the small cross in her hands, tracing its smooth contours with her fingertips. Tears she had not allowed herself to shed during the day now fell freely, dampening the wooden symbol with their silent testimony to both joy and fear. How long could this continue? How many days remained before the Count acted on his suspicions? She had no illusions about her husband's character. He was not a man who forgave, not a man who overlooked perceived slights to his honor. If he believed her unfaithful, his retribution would be swift and merciless. Yet even knowing this, even understanding the sword that hung over her head, Helga could not summon regret for the feelings that had awakened within her. For the first time in her life, she had experienced connection that went beyond duty or arrangement, had glimpsed a world where love might be freely given and received, not bartered like goods at market. She pressed the cross to her lips in the darkness of her chamber, a gesture both prayer and defiance. Whatever came next, however brief their time might be, she would not surrender this one precious truth, that she had known, if only for a moment, what it meant to be truly seen and cherished by another soul. A escola irreversible. 3 days passed in a strange, suspended state of tension. Count Ragnar had returned from his excursion late that night, offering no explanation for his absence and making no further mention of loyalty or vows. Instead, he had treated Helga with an icy formality more unsettling than open accusation. He watched her constantly when they were together, his eyes following her movements with predatory attention, as though waiting for her to make a mistake. On the morning of the 4th day, as Helga broke her fast in the great hall under her husband's scrutinizing gaze, a messenger arrived bearing a sealed parchment. The Count read it silently, his expression unchanging, before folding it carefully and tucking it into his belt. "It seems I am summoned to attend the King's Council in the southern province," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the hall. "Border disputes require the attention of all lords with holdings near the contested territories." Helga kept her face carefully neutral, though her heart leapt at the news. "How long will you be gone, my lord?" she asked, her tone appropriately concerned. "A fortnight at least," he replied, studying her reaction. "The journey alone requires 5 days each way. 2 weeks of freedom from his oppressive presence. 2 weeks without his cold eyes tracking her every movement." Helga lowered her gaze to hide the relief she knew must be visible there. "I shall pray daily for your safe return," she said demurely. The Count's lips curved in what might have been a smile on another man's face. On his, it resembled nothing so much as a grimace. "I'm certain you will occupy yourself appropriately in my absence," he remarked, the words carrying a subtle threat. "My steward will remain to oversee the household affairs." And to watch her, the unspoken meaning hung between them. Helga inclined her head in acknowledgement, her fingers tightening around her goblet. "When do you depart?" she asked. "Tomorrow, at first light," he responded. "The matter is urgent, and winter approaches. The mountain passes will soon be treacherous." The rest of the day passed in a flurry of preparations. Servants hurried through the castle, packing appropriate clothing and provisions for the Count's journey. Helga supervised with perfect correctness, giving no outward indication of the tumultuous thoughts that occupied her mind. Only once did she catch a glimpse of Eric, crossing the courtyard with Sir Leif. Their eyes met for the briefest of moments. No expression, no acknowledgement, nothing that could be remarked upon by watching eyes. Yet in that fleeting contact, Helga felt a current of understanding pass between them. They both recognized the opportunity that the Count's absence presented. That evening, as Helga helped her husband review the household accounts before his departure, a task he insisted upon despite her limited knowledge of such matters, he paused, fixing her with that same cold, assessing stare. "Remember your place while I am gone, wife," he said quietly. "Remember your vows." Helga met his gaze with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "I am the Countess of this castle," she replied. "I know my duties well." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, apparently satisfied by what he saw, or perhaps simply confident in the vigilance of those he was leaving behind to monitor her actions. The following dawn broke clear and cold, the courtyard bustling with activity as the Count's traveling party assembled. Helga stood on the steps of the great hall, wrapped in a fur-lined cloak against the biting autumn air, playing her role of devoted wife with practiced precision. She watched as the Count mounted his massive warhorse, surrounded by a dozen armed men, an appropriate escort for a nobleman of his stature. "Farewell, my lord husband," she called, pitching her voice to carry across the courtyard. "May God speed your journey and bring you safely home." The Count's eyes found hers one last time, sharp and knowing beneath his heavy brows. He did not smile, did not offer any tender parting words. Instead, he inclined his head in curt acknowledgement before turning his horse toward the gatehouse. The thunder of hoofbeats on the cobblestones echoed through the morning air as the party departed, fading gradually into silence as they passed beyond the castle walls. Helga remained on the steps long after they had disappeared from view, aware of the eyes that watched her from windows and doorways. Only when the cold had seeped through her cloak did she turn and re-enter the great hall, her face composed, her steps measured and unhurried. The first 3 days of the Count's absence passed without incident. Helga maintained her regular routine, supervising the household, attending to her needlework, praying in the chapel at appropriate hours. The steward, a thin man with perpetually narrowed eyes, appeared at her side with suspicious frequency, offering assistance she did not require, asking questions that probed subtly for information. On the fourth day, as Helga walked in the inner garden, enjoying a brief respite from the chill wind, she found a folded piece of parchment tucked beneath a stone bench. Her heart racing, she glanced around to ensure she was truly alone before retrieving it and slipping it into her sleeve. Only later, in the privacy of her chamber with the door securely barred, did she unfold the note. Eric's handwriting, now familiar from his previous message, covered the small scrap of parchment. "The opportunity we may never have again is before us," he had written. "Sir Leif departs tomorrow for his own lands, taking half the remaining guards with him. I am not required to accompany him. Meet me at the postern gate at midnight if your answer is yes." Yes to what? Eric had been careful not to commit the full extent of his proposition to writing, but Helga understood immediately. This was no invitation to another stolen moment in an abandoned tower. This was an invitation to flee, to leave behind the castle, her title, her security, everything she had known, to escape with Eric, to build a life somewhere far from the Count's reach. The idea was simultaneously terrifying and intoxicating. Helga sank onto the edge of her bed, the parchment trembling in her hands. The practical obstacles seemed insurmountable. Where would they go? How would they live? The Count's influence extended throughout the region. His rage would be implacable. He would hunt them relentlessly, sparing no expense to reclaim his property and exact revenge on the man who had stolen it. And yet the alternative was to remain here, trapped in a loveless marriage to a man who already suspected her of infidelity. How long before his suspicion hardened into certainty? How long before he decided to dispose of another inconvenient wife? The wooden cross Eric had sent her seemed to burn against her skin where she wore it concealed beneath her gown, a constant reminder of what was at stake. "Now or never," she whispered, echoing words she imagined Eric saying. The choice before her was stark in its finality: remain and eventually face the Count's wrath, or flee and face a lifetime of uncertainty and danger. Throughout the day, Helga moved through her duties as if in a dream, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. The steward seemed to watch her more closely than ever, his narrow eyes following her movements with suspicious attention. Had he intercepted Eric's note? Did he already know of their plans? No, impossible. If he knew, she would already be locked in her chambers, guards posted at her door. The note had reached her safely, its secret remained intact. As night fell, bringing with it a penetrating chill that seeped through the stone walls of the castle, Helga sat at her small writing desk, a single candle illuminating the blank parchment before her. The quill trembled in her fingers as she began to write, then stopped, uncertain what words could possibly convey the turmoil in her heart. How did one decide between safety and passion? Between duty and desire? Between the known misery of her current life and the unknown perils of flight? She thought of her father, who had bartered her away like a prized heifer, caring nothing for her happiness. Of the village women who had whispered and pointed as she passed, their eyes full of pity and speculation. Of the Count, with his cold eyes and grasping hands, who saw her as nothing more than a vessel for his heirs. Then she thought of Eric, his gentle touch, his steadfast gaze, the way he looked at her as though she were a treasure beyond price rather than property to be possessed. The memory of their single kiss in the abandoned tower still burned within her, a flame that refused to be extinguished by fear or reason. With sudden decision, Helga dipped her quill into the inkpot and began to write. The words flowed freely now, her hand steady as she committed her thoughts to parchment. This letter would be her final statement, her declaration of independence, her leap into the unknown. When she had finished, she read the words once more by the guttering candlelight, then carefully folded the parchment and sealed it with a drop of wax. No signet ring pressed into the soft seal. She was not writing as the Countess, but as Helga, a woman claiming her own destiny for perhaps the first time in her life. The castle bell tolled the 11th hour. She had 1 hour remaining to prepare, 1 hour to gather what few possessions she could carry, 1 hour to say a silent farewell to the life she had known. Reaching beneath her mattress, Helga withdrew a small pouch containing the only wealth she could truly call her own, a silver bracelet that had belonged to her mother, a few coins saved from household expenses, a small pearl pin given to her by the Count's sister. Would it be enough to sustain them until they found safety? She had no way of knowing. In the world beyond the castle walls, she had no experience, no skills beyond those of a nobleman's daughter and wife. What could she offer besides the burden of her presence, the danger of her status as a runaway wife? As the minutes ticked inexorably toward midnight, doubt gnawed at her resolve. Was she being unforgivably selfish? Was she condemning Eric to a life of looking over his shoulder, forever hunted? Would he come to resent her when the romantic glow of their escape faded, replaced by the harsh reality of poverty and fear? The letter lay on her desk, its presence both accusation and promise. Within it, she had poured out her heart, her fears, her hopes, her decision. Whatever happened next, those words would remain, testimony to this moment of terrible, wonderful choice. A verdad y a moral. The great hall of Count Ragnar's castle had never been so crowded. Nobles from neighboring estates, village elders, merchants, and servants all stood in tense silence as the Count himself paced before the high table, his face contorted with barely controlled fury. The letter, now crumpled from his violent handling, lay on the table beside the wooden cross that had been found among Helga's possessions. "Read it again," the Count commanded, his voice deadly quiet in the hush of the hall. "Let everyone hear the words of my faithless wife." The steward, visibly uncomfortable with his role in this public humiliation, cleared his throat and unfolded the parchment with trembling fingers. His voice echoed in the cavernous space as he began to read. "To those who find this letter, I make no apologies for my departure. I was not asked if I wished to be sold in marriage to a man old enough to be my grandfather. I was not consulted about the bartering of my body and future for my father's advantage. I have been a possession, passed from one man to another with no more consideration than a farmer gives a goat at market. Yet even possessions may dream of freedom. Even the caged bird remembers what it means to fly. In the Esquire Eric, I have found not just the possibility of escape, but the certainty that I am more than property to be traded. I have found recognition of my humanity in a world that has denied it at every turn. I do not leave in shame, though many will call me shameful. I do not depart in dishonor, though those who profit from the bartering of women will declare me dishonorable. I leave with the knowledge that there exists in this world something more valuable than titles or land or gold, the freedom to choose one's own path and the courage to walk it regardless of consequence. Let it be known that I, Helga, no longer Countess nor chattel, have claimed my life as my own." The steward's voice faltered as he finished reading, his eyes darting nervously toward the Count, who stood rigid with rage. A murmur swept through the assembled crowd, shock, disapproval, and something else, a current of reluctant admiration that grew stronger as the words settled into the collective consciousness. "Outrageous!" declared an elderly nobleman, his jowls quivering with indignation. "The girl should be hunted down and punished for such impudence." "Along with the servant who dared to raise his eyes to his master's wife," added another, nodding vigorously. The Count raised a hand for silence, his cold eyes surveying the crowd. "They will be found," he stated with deadly certainty. "No matter how far they run, no matter where they hide, they will be brought back to face justice for this betrayal." A small sound of dissent came from the back of the hall, quickly stifled but audible in the tense silence. The Count's head snapped up, his gaze searching for the source of the interruption. "Who dares?" he demanded, his voice like the crack of a whip. To everyone's surprise, it was Greta who stepped forward, her work-worn hands clasped before her, her back straight despite her years. "I dare, my lord," she said, her voice steady though her face was pale. "Not to contradict, but to speak a truth that perhaps should be heard." The Count's eyebrows rose in disbelief at the serving woman's temerity. "And what truth might that be, old woman?" he asked, his tone dangerous. Greta met his gaze without flinching. "That the Lady Helga was little more than a child when she was brought here as your bride. That she came not with joy but with resignation. yet served you faithfully until her heart found something you had never offered her: kindness without expectation. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. No one had ever spoken to the Count with such boldness, certainly not a servant, and most definitely not about so personal a matter as his marriage. "You forget yourself," the Count growled, taking a menacing step toward Greta. "Your years of service will not protect you from the consequences of such insolence." "Perhaps not," Greta acknowledged, seeming to draw strength rather than fear from his threat. "But I am old, my lord, and have little left to lose. The Lady Helga is young, with her whole life ahead of her." "Can you say in truth that you offered her anything resembling happiness? Can you claim that your gold bought her heart as easily as it bought her hand?" Another murmur swept through the crowd, louder this time. The Count's face darkened with fury, but before he could respond, another voice joined the conversation, this one from the midst of the assembled villagers. "She always had a sadness in her eyes," said an old woman, her weathered face creased with the wisdom of many years. "Even when she smiled and greeted us kindly in the market. A young bride should glow with happiness, not move like one already in mourning." "Silence!" the Count roared, his control slipping. "I will not be lectured on my own marriage by peasants and servants." Yet it seemed a dam had broken. One by one, voices rose from the assembly, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. "The esquire treated her with respect," observed a stable boy. "I saw them once in the courtyard. He bowed to her not because she was the countess, but because he truly honored her. She never complained," added a kitchen maid. "Not even when the wine was spilled on her new gown at the harvest feast. She helped clean it herself, smiling as though it mattered not at all. The gold can buy silences, but not hearts," said the village blacksmith, echoing the words from Helga's letter with a thoughtfulness that belied his rough appearance. "Perhaps there's wisdom in remembering that." The Count stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief as his authority eroded before his eyes. This was not how such revelations were meant to unfold. Public humiliation was to be Helga's fate, not his. The narrative was supposed to condemn her, to solidify his position as the wronged husband, the betrayed lord deserving of sympathy and support in his righteous anger. Instead, something unexpected was happening. The truth, or at least a different version of it than the one he had intended to establish, was emerging like a spring seedling pushing through snow, fragile yet surprisingly resilient. "Enough," he finally thundered, slamming his fist upon the high table with such force that goblets toppled and spilled their contents. "I did not summon you here to debate the matter. I called you to witness the shame of a faithless wife and the punishment that awaits her when she is found." A tense silence fell over the hall, but it was different now, charged with an energy that had not been present before. The Count's gaze swept over the assembly, noting the averted eyes, the subtle shifting of feet, the way the villagers seemed to stand just slightly closer together than before, as though drawing strength from their collective presence. It was then that the castle doors swung open with a great creaking of hinges. All heads turned as a figure stepped into the hall, silhouetted against the bright autumn sunlight beyond. For one wild moment, the Count thought it might be Helga herself, returned to face the consequences of her actions. Instead, it was Sir Leif, the Count's nephew, who strode down the center of the hall, his expression grave as he approached the high table. "Uncle," he said, bowing formally before turning to address the assembly. "I bring news from the eastern road. I encountered Lady Helga and my former esquire some 5 leagues from here." The Count leaned forward eagerly, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "And? You have brought them back for judgment." Sir Leif hesitated, something like discomfort crossing his features. "No, uncle, I did not." "What?" The Count's voice was dangerously soft. "You found my runaway wife and her lover, and you let them go?" "I found 2 people who spoke to me with such dignity and conviction that I could not, in good conscience, force them to return," Sir Leif replied steadily. "The Lady Helga asked me to deliver a message to this assembly. She said, 'Tell them I do not run from shame, but toward truth. Tell them I have found my voice, and with it, my freedom.'" The Count's face had turned an alarming shade of purple. "You betray your own blood for the pretty words of an adulteress?" Sir Leif met his uncle's gaze without flinching. I choose to honor courage when I see it, regardless of where it appears. The Lady Helga spoke without tears, without cowering, with a strength I have rarely witnessed. She asked for no forgiveness, offered no apology. She simply stood before me as one human being to another and claimed her right to determine her own path. Something in his words seemed to resonate through the hall, touching each person present in some private, perhaps unacknowledged corner of their hearts. The silence that followed was not one of fear or tension, but of reflection. It was Greta who finally broke it, her aged voice carrying clearly to every corner of the great hall. "The gold can buy silences," she repeated, "but not hearts." She looked directly at the Count, decades of servitude falling away as she spoke her truth at last. "There is no greater shame than to live without love, my lord. Not the love that possesses and controls, but the love that sees and cherishes. That is the lesson here, if we have wisdom enough to hear it." The Count stood rigid, his authority visibly crumbling before this unexpected rebellion. The nobles shifted uncomfortably, caught between traditional loyalties and the undeniable power of the truth being spoken. The villagers and servants stood straighter, something like hope kindling in eyes long accustomed to lowering their gaze. And somewhere, far beyond the castle walls, Helga and Eric continued their journey toward an uncertain future, carrying with them not gold or titles or land, but something far more valuable: the freedom to love without chains, to build a life founded on mutual respect rather than ownership, to write their own story instead of living one dictated by others. In the great hall of Count Ragnar's castle, a small revolution of thought had begun. Quiet, perhaps, and incomplete, yet irreversible. For once a truth is spoken aloud, it cannot be unheard. And the truth that echoed in every heart that day was simple, yet profound. There is no greater shame than to live without love. Helga's journey reminds us that true freedom often demands the highest price. In a world where women were considered property, she found the courage to claim her humanity, to declare that a heart cannot be bought or sold like cattle at market. Would you have had the strength to walk away from security and status for the uncertain promise of love? Could you have stood before the world, unashamed of choosing your own path? The greatest cage is often the one we accept without question. Society's expectations, family obligations, the comfort of the familiar, these silent chains can bind us more tightly than any dungeon. Helga's story challenges us to examine our own lives. Where have we surrendered our truth for safety? What dreams have we abandoned at the altar of convention? If this story moved you, if it made you question or reflect on the courage it takes to live authentically, please share it with someone who might need to hear this message today. Follow our channel for more tales that illuminate the human spirit in its darkest and brightest moments. Remember, in the words Helga discovered, there is no greater shame than to live without love. Like, share, and join us next week for another story that will touch your heart and stir your soul.